Hello, everyone, and welcome to November's Maple Leaf Host External Speaker Series. My name is Heather Carroll, and I am so happy to introduce our international panel today. Joining us from Manchester Metropolitan University, we have Dr. Claire Hamshire and Dr. Rachel Forsyth. We have Dr. Paul Taylor joining us from the University of Leeds, Dr. Heather Smith from the University of Northern British Columbia, and Dr. Jessica Riddell from Bishop's University. Please note that today's session is being recorded. Before we begin, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Maple League of Universities are built on lands of Indigenous peoples, the Abenaki Confederacy, or the Abenaki people of the Wabanaki Confederacy at Bishop's, and the Mi'kmaq at Acadia, Mount Allison, and St. Francis Xavier Universities. Across our consortium, we value Indigenous ways of knowing and honor the hard work ahead on truth, reconciliation, and justice with Indigenous peoples. So without further ado, I would just like to introduce this panel of educational leaders from 4 universities and 2 continents. Today, they're going to explore what constitutes a resilient and hopeful university and how do we build it. So to start off, I would like to hand it over to Jessica Riddell and Heather Smith to discuss the origin story about how this panel came to be and what the gorillas are.
Thanks so much, Heather, and thanks everyone for joining us. The conversation started back in 2012 when I attended my first STLHE conference. STLHE, for non-Canadians, is the Society of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. And it was hosted in Montreal, and it was my first foray into teaching and learning and pedagogy. I'm a Shakespearean, both by training and disposition, so this was a whole new world for me. And I stumbled upon a group of people who I then internet stalked. They were the 3M National Teaching Fellows. And for me, they, as a group and as individuals, captured a lot of the things I was trying to articulate in my own work, but was feeling a difficult way to navigate or to connect. So these 3M National Teaching Fellows were outliers and innovators. They were working and building things often despite the conditions within which they were working. And so I was lucky enough to find this group and to attend a panel of 3M National Teaching Fellows who were talking about educational leadership more broadly. And there were a number of people on the panel, and they had a very loose thought prompt, which was, please define your model of educational leadership. And so, totally wrapped completely into this panel, I heard from so many different inspirational leaders, and they were talking about transformative leadership, they were talking about distributed leadership, they were talking about leadership of change, leadership not as a title or as a status, but as a mindset and a way of being. I was listening to this, and it was all really warm and inspiring, and then Heather Smith came on and said, I think that's great. I think I love everything that everyone's talking about, but my brand as a political scientist, as a feminist, is a little bit more aware of and invites into the conversation conflict and contestation. And we all know from our own experiences that change is sometimes difficult and it's sometimes uncomfortable. And so her words just resonated for me. And I think I followed up with her maybe after the panel or maybe at the next annual conference at Queen's, and I said, have you written about this notion of guerrilla leadership, this notion of working in the margins with people, often marginalized or underrepresented groups, to enact meaningful change? And she said, no, but that's worth the chat. That's worth the conversation. And from those sort of seeds started a longer process of us then finding other guerrilla leaders internationally through various organizations. But I'd like to pass the baton over to Heather to talk to us a little bit about her thinking of guerrilla leadership and some of the design principles she's pulling from her own work and her own pedagogy. So Heather Smith.
Oh my goodness. So what happened on this panel was that, we were supposed to talk about leadership, and it was all the sort of standard conversations around leadership using the literature that's out there. But I had reflected on a conversation with a family member who talked about leadership on the ground and leadership by walking around, and that it's not enough to simply sort of sit and adopt particular principles. You actually have to talk to people and know what's going on. And I think that teaching and learning is actually a cultural movement, and in fact, a cultural movement that pushes against neoliberal norms that dominate our institutions. So this got me thinking about Che Guevara and guerrilla warfare. Keep in mind, I'm a political scientist, and this metaphor may not work for a lot of folks. But if you look at some of the writings around Guevara, it's about how do you foster change on the margins, and how do you engage in sort of revolutionary practice, and how do you engage in practice that is structural practice, structural change. And there were these elements in various manifestos, one of which stands out still, about how guerrillas work together in cells and they carry out action in wild places of small population. And it really is about transformative and structural change that is inherently political, insofar as it understands that power resides in multiple sites. And so this led Jessica and I to do a series of workshops about sites of sort of cultural change using these principles of guerrilla leadership, which challenges neoliberal norms. And as a result, our lovely colleagues from Britain joined us. And since then, we've been having conversations about how this plays out, and you'll hear more from them today.
Thank you,
Thanks
Heather.
so much for that explanation. Jessica, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I do. I have just one quick intervention about the work that we did at a conference recently. The last time we could gather together, we were in Atlanta, Georgia, and it was on the heels of a conference that we had done where we had proposed guerrilla leadership as this proposal as an abstract to run a session through ISOTL, the International Society of Teaching and Learning, and our proposal got rejected. So we decided to host a special session in the hotel lobby at the bar with some literature and some breakout groups in informal spaces outside of the actual organizational structure. And it was one of those great moments. It was playful, it was delightful, it was generative, it was inclusive, and it was trying to create spaces maybe where the conversations at the centers of power are not maybe open to some of that candid and contested set of conversations. Then I came across a quote recently that said that people closest to the solutions are often farthest from the centers of power. And I think that captures some of the work that we try to do, especially as student-focused work, working with students as partners, as collaborators, and as key change agents. So I'm just delighted to be on this panel with some of my favorite thought partners about positive, inclusive institutional change.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So our first question would be, in the time of COVID, are we making more spaces for this type of leadership? Or do you think that this type of leadership has kind of gone mainstream? And I'll ask that to Paul and then over to Claire.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you so much for the invitation to join the panel. It's fantastic to be here. In characteristic style, my answer to the question is, I think, neither. So how do I get there? Well, my inspiration's been for a long time the pedagogy of Paulo Freire and his call to us all to unveil opportunities for hope. Interestingly, Freire was a contemporary of Che Guevara, seen by many as wanting the same goals as Che, but through education rather than combat. And so Heather referred to the fact that the guerrilla notion has unsettled some people we've worked with, and so maybe Freire can be a somewhat more comfortable companion here. This summer I reread Freire's Pedagogy of Hope, and I think many people who have read Freire, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Pedagogy of Hope, will have understood that for him, education is a key or the key route to liberation. What I reflected on having reread the Pedagogy of Hope was that the converse also emerges from that book for me. What I mean is that without liberation, we can't educate. As educators, we need to liberate ourselves. In the closing passages of the Pedagogy of Hope, Freire describes his visit to El Salvador, and he says, "We paid a visit to a lovely clearing in a forest, kind of theatrical stage on which the guerrillas met to engage in discussion, dreaming, self-appraisal, recreation." I'm not sure in the recent months we've had very much time for dreaming and recreation, but I do think this kind of clearing is there. The clearing was probably always there, but the pandemics perhaps made it easier for people to drift into. And as in so doing, I think we've been freed from the physical constraints of normal university life. For me, the clock tower, the Senate chamber, the great hall where students usually graduate, the oak panelled lecture theatre. And somehow we're educating perfectly well without all these things. So I think the pandemic's made it easier to find this clearing and become guerrillas. But no, I don't think it's mainstream. In El Salvador, progress was made because the country's leaders joined the guerrillas in the clearing. Today, as far as I can see, in the UK, university leaders are not really heading that way. I think they're staying away from the clearing, and I think they can't wait to put their suits and ties back on and get themselves back in the Senate chamber and the boardroom. So I don't think that guerrilla is mainstream yet. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. And over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Heather. I have a slightly different view, which is hence why we're all a panel together. So I think when we first thought about this question, when the five of us actually met informally last month, my first reaction was most definitely. I do believe that the pandemic has allowed guerrilla thinking to go mainstream. And I think that has meant that we've been able to free ourselves from what to me often feels like wading through the treacle of regulations that the university has. And so I think by being able to flex and move at speed, we've really achieved that. So at Manchester Met, we've got a very large institution. We've got about 33,000 students. And therefore, previously, trying to make changes to policy or processes or programmes actually felt really time consuming. In March, when we moved all of our teaching online and we made changements to all of our assessments through what we put in place were emergency regulations, we were really agile and innovative. On a personal level, that was really important to me because I work in a faculty of health, psychology and social care. And there were obviously particular challenges for our students. And I think the freedom and the flexibility and the availability to sort of flex and stretch our processes as the year went on has meant that we've actually managed to get our students to complete their work-based placements, some virtually, some actually in hospitals. They've done practical skills exams, and we've still yet met the requirements of our professional bodies. I have to say that is testament to the amazing staff and the commitment of our students. So I think as I reflect back, we've made significant changes, and I think as a university leadership, we've learned from that, and I think we're less cautious. I think we're much more keen to embrace change, and we're looking at the way that we can move at pace and offer the best options we can to our students. Do I think we've made all the right decisions? Then that's a no, because I'm sure we haven't. But I think our intention has always been to how can we benefit our students by making change at pace to make sure that they're not disadvantaged during the pandemic. And I think there's been that real willingness to flex and stretch across processes. So I think it's interesting as we may or may not be returning to business as usual. Clearly, we're past our first lockdown. In the UK, we're in our second lockdown. But I am hoping that we build back better to be a more compassionate university and take that ability to meet our student needs at the centre of what we do a little bit further.
Thank you, Claire. I'll now offer the same question to Rachel, Jessica, and Heather. Rachel?
Thank you.
I'm so glad Paul said neither, because I wanted to say both. The question is, are we making more spaces for guerrilla, or has guerrilla gone mainstream? And in the time of the pandemic, and I feel like it is both. So Claire and I work in the same institution. I'm responsible for the University Teaching Academy, which is a centre for teaching and learning. So trying to juggle a lot of plates in supporting change. But I think that teachers, professional services staff, which is what you may call them administrators, so as Claire pointed out, and students have just all been really resourceful in making changes to their own situations to cope with pandemic-induced challenges. So it's helped people to step outside that rigidity, which Claire mentioned. We have such a large institution that it's very easy for things to all become sort of a little bit vanilla, as Jessica would say. But actually, people have had to be really nimble and step outside their norms. So they've had opportunities to be guerrilla, or they felt confident in being a bit more guerrilla about things than they might have done before. And I think that's applied right across, because lots of students have had to adapt to, it's been really challenging for them, as it has for staff. So maybe if it's become mainstream as an approach, it's not guerrilla anymore. But I don't think that really matters, as long as students and staff are having better experiences overall. So I think it's here to stay, and I'm personally going to fight what Paul said of all getting. It's not so much the location of it, but the idea that we've just done this temporarily. Some things have worked, and students are telling us really clearly what's worked, and we must work with that. So that's me, and I've forgotten who's next. Jess.
Thanks, Rachel. And, I think I love this neither, both, and, because I do think that captures the complexity and the unevenness of the responses to this radical disruption of our space and place and practice. And it's been fascinating for me to see who has been open to going from expert to learner, from, having mastery of content to curiosity around delivery. The people who are used to being speech makers, who are choosing to listen, and to listen carefully to people who might not normally or historically have voices, to go from our comfort zones of specialized disciplinary knowledge into those spaces of joy and wonder. And there's this great concept of wonder talked about by an early modernist, Stephen Greenblatt, who talks about wonder not in the ways that we understand wonder, which is wonderful, right? We talk about something that is good as wonderful. But he talks about the encounters with the New World in the 16th century, and for people with these mindsets, with the European explorers standing on the edge of something they don't have an apparatus to understand. So wonder can be positive, but it can also just be the gap between what you know and what you're encountering that you don't have the tools to understand or to interpret yet. And so wonder can be terrifying and uncomfortable, and we've seen that play out in a number of different spheres, whether that is at the Senate table or in the metaphorical forest clearings. And what I've been really trying to think about as we see different responses to this global pandemic is framing this as an opportunity. An opportunity. Arundhati Roy, a Canadian novelist, talks about the pandemic as a portal. And she asks us, as we're transforming, as we're moving through this portal, what do we want to take with us? And what do we want to leave behind? And it's a powerful excerpt that I continue to go back to almost every week, because it reminds me that we have choices about how we're responding and agency for change. So she talks about this portal, quote, and I'll put it in the chat, as a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little baggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And I think those people ready to fight for a world that are better and more inclusive are guerrillas, and guerrillas can be allies in various spaces across our and outside of our institutions. So I think that that for me, it's, neither for Paul, both for Rachel, yes, and for Claire, and for me, framing it really as an opportunity or as a journey forward. What choices do we make, and who do we want to work with to imagine a better world?
Thank you, Jessica, and I'll hand it over to Heather for the final word for this question.
Well, consistent with the gorilla theme here, I'm going to say it depends. As I noted in the introduction, as a feminist political scientist, one of the things I think about is the way in which power is part of our everyday. And so as someone who is teaching online and hearing stories, both good and bad, about the student experience, I'm going to say it depends. Whether or not Black Lives Matter movement, whether or not Indigenous rights movements, whether or not the exposed inequalities and vulnerabilities that have come with COVID have been acknowledged, in part will depend on the instructors in the classroom in that micro space. So maybe leaders are listening, but what about how we create our course outlines? What about who is included in the way we think about how our courses are designed, generally speaking? Do we think about technology? Do we think about access in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different learning modes? And so for me, I guess it depends, because I've heard and continue to hear prime examples of Indigenous students who have never actually read something about Indigenous experiences in their classrooms, or Black students who have faced discrimination when they raise particular questions that don't fit with the mindset of the instructor. And so we can guerrilla as much as we want, but if we are then working in particular margins, but there's whole sets of students who are excluded by our everyday practices. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. I think there are opportunities for opening, for sure. But if we think in the micro, if we think about guerrilla as an everyday practice, where are we complicit and where do we have agency and how do we support our students? So for me, it depends.
Thank you, Heather, and that segues perfectly into our next question, which is whose voices need to be heard for the world to change, or whether that's the university world or the world in general, and where are there spaces for hope in your work and your world? So I'll start with Claire and then Rachel.
Thank you, Heather. My role is faculty head of education in part, which means I have overview of the education of all the students in the Faculty of Health, Psychology, Social Care. And I would like to believe that as part of that role, I'm always actively listening, and that's to our students and to our staff. And I think that comes from a place of being respectfully curious to find out what we can improve and what we're doing well and what not. And I think that's that then ensuring that I hear those voices, and it's that hearing that's important. As well as my leadership role in the faculty, I'm also a professor, and my main research is around narratives. And so again, that's around listening and connecting with people, and it's very much through the art of storytelling. I've done a lot of research around stories. Actually, we did some guerrilla work around using story templates as well. And I think the notion of that is about looking through someone else's eyes, because that will show you your institution, and it will offer up some questions that you need to ask yourself, and for you to pause, to think, and to reflect, and ultimately for all of us to learn more about how we're perceived by the users of our services and about the staff we work with. So to answer the question, whose voices do we need to hear for the world to change? For me, I want to hear the quiet voices, because we hear a lot of those noisy voices, and sometimes that is mine as well, I feel I should say. But some people don't always get the audience or the exposure that they actually deserve. And so listening to those voices, hearing them, and most importantly, locating those voices should hopefully be central to how we're going to now review and adapt our processes over the next few months, few years, who knows. So ultimately, I think the more we listen to those voices, the more we understand, and that helps us understand that experience and move forwards. As an institution, ours, and I'm sure all institutions, we seem to collect endless amounts of data on our students about how they progress, how well they do, their grades, and where they go on to. But if you know me well, you'll know that I rail against this collection of statistics, because really statistics are not the whole story. A learning journey is a personal, emotional journey, and at any age, and it can't simply be measured on these 5-point scales that we use, or these questions that say what was the best thing or what was the worst about our students. So again, that listening to these stories, to the really hearing, hopefully will mean that as we go forward, we can create a space for hope. But to do so, we need to make sure that all voices are valued, and that we do that time to pause, that time to learn, and that time to make the right changes as we go forwards.
Thank you, Claire. I'll pass it over to Rachel and then Jessica.
And I think just the challenge here is hearing everyone's voice, because the simple answer is, of course, everyone's voice is important, and everyone who, in the 1990s parlance, is a stakeholder in these processes. But in as part of our community is more what we'd be thinking now. But even I feel very conscious, even just trying to answer that question, it just exposes the problem, because I can sit here, I'm sitting, not standing, I can sit here and say, of course we should hear everyone's voices, but I'm very conscious looking around that here we sit of a certain type ourselves, and that's not a criticism of anyone, because that's me too, and conscious of the need to get on with things and make changes, because everything isn't entirely fair. But the hope that I have is that we can facilitate what's happening, and this is where I think the guerrilla metaphor works. I'm not keen on the guerrilla metaphor in terms of as we've discussed, in terms of the sort of violence part of it, but the idea of people sitting, I think being put in the chat about co-conspirators, so talking around a campfire as equals, rather than through Paul kind of conjured up this idea of wood-panelled Senate rooms where decisions are made. No doubt they were smoke-filled rooms at one time, but not anymore. But I think so we can make spaces to sit and try to have those conversations and be aware of one's own privilege in trying to make it easier for other people who may feel uncomfortable in those spaces to join those spaces. So the spaces for hope, to take that metaphor, stretch it as far as it will go, is clearing those paths so that more people can get to the campfire, and then sitting and listening to their stories and valuing those stories, so that they feel that they've got more confidence and agency. Is a word that it's already gone into chat, but I think it's really important, because talking to people and them feeling they don't have the agency means that we're not going to move forward at all. It's still always going to be my interpretation of what they're trying to do that moves forward, rather than their own. And I think it's difficult, but the hope is in sitting there and listening to those amazing stories. You feel that these things are possible. And Sarah pointed out the everyday places and the microspaces is where that has just got to happen and got to become more valued, and where people have more access. But then we need to funnel that upwards so that there's real change. So I am really hopeful. I think education is an ultimately hopeful process. I wouldn't do it if we didn't think that there was some value to that. So that's me. I'll pass it over.
Thanks, Rachel. And just to add and maybe take it in a slightly different direction, I absolutely I love that respectfully listening piece that Claire introduced, and Rachel talking about creating those spaces and those microcultures for that listening to happen. I would add the element of listening, but also being willing to transform with the uncomfortable truths that might come through that listening process. And I, as a Shakespearean, I always think through Shakespeare's plays, and King Lear for me really resonates as a negative exemplar for what happens when you are not listening to people outside of centers of power. So if you think about King Lear, he is fine at the first 30 lines of the play. He's happy, everything's stable, he's well loved. His favorite daughter is a precocious and saucy one, not the rule followers, the elder two. His favorite counselor is the wise counselor Kent, who advises him and challenges him when he thinks he's making a decision. And his beloved licensed court jester, the fool, speaks some of the most uncomfortable truths, calls him nothing and an O without a figure and a hollow egg, and a devastating in his critique. And yet at the outset of the play, this fool has a licensed space, is paid to speak uncomfortable truths, and Lear has to listen as part of the balance of power. In fact, in Act 3, when he loses his mind because he's banished his truth tellers and lost all of his external perspective, he has this moment where he says, take physic, pomp, take medicine, you arrogant leader, and feel what wretches feel. And for him, that is a redemptive moment, or at least an awareness of the importance of hearing and listening, but also being disrupted from your center based on uncomfortable truths. So we have to be willing and vulnerable and courageous enough to listen to things we may not want to hear in order to transform together. So that's where I take Shakespeare, but I also take that and try to surround myself with people who are going to challenge me and say, I don't agree, or have you thought about it this way? And even though it is uncomfortable, difficult sometimes, and takes a little bit more work and negotiation, is absolutely essential to that process.
Thank you, Jessica, and I'll hand it over to Heather and then Paul.
All right. So I'll be quick on this. I think we need to do more than listen to the uncomfortable truths. We actually need to do something about it. We have a long history of talking to folks and claiming we'll make change within our institutions, within our own countries, and so forth. And so it's not enough to listen. It's actually significant to show that we act, and also act in ways that may have implications for us, right? And acknowledge that. And that is more difficult than I think we want to acknowledge, right? So we can listen, and we can take the uncomfortable truths, but if we don't act, then it's just pointless. And I just want to note there was a second part about spaces of hope, and for me that is working with my students. So providing spaces in ways that I see them talking about hope, and I see them talking about their own agency, and that gives me hope, because they are learning online in the midst of a pandemic, and they are still hopeful. And to me, that's a really beautiful thing, and really grounds my practice and inspires me to do what I do, and actually to do it better.
Thanks, Heather. Paul, any final thoughts?
Keep this one really brief, but just tell you about something exciting that happened in Leeds as a direct result of the pandemic and the crisis. We realised very much that we needed to listen to everyone, as my colleagues have been saying. And one of the things we heard was the importance of a sense of belonging. And so a group of people just got together somehow in true guerrilla style and created a thing that was then supported by the university to develop some resources around the sense of belonging. The slogan on that I really like, is never underestimate the difference you can make. Never underestimate the difference you can make. And we talked for a long time about what we meant by a sense of belonging, and ended up just pulling a literature definition from Goodenough from 1993. It's a student's sense of being accepted, valued, included, and encouraged by others, teachers and peers, in the academic classroom setting, and of feeling oneself to be an important part of the life and activity of the class. More than simple perceived liking or warmth, it also involves support and respect for personal autonomy, and for the student as an individual. And that last part there, the autonomy, is something I can come back to in the last question. We started to work on in true guerrilla style, and a wonderful colleague, Bridget, has joined us today, she really has worked truly guerrilla style over the summer to build some momentum around this sense of belonging, autonomy and authenticity that I'll come back to in responding to the final question.
Thanks so much, Paul. And on to our final question, which is, how do we build a resilient and hopeful university? So I'll pass it to Rachel and then Jessica.
Well, this is the best bit, really, isn't it? And I feel that it's an entirely doable prospect. And you know, Jessica's put up a link to her blog, and it's very much speaks to this. But I think, yeah, in the most basic way, we model those behaviours. We are hopeful, we are resilient, we are creating those spaces as much as we can. We talk to students, we talk to teachers. So in my case, my teaching is all of university teachers, but better than that, I get great conversations, but also they invite me into their class as part of their role to watch their teaching, and I'm constantly energized by seeing that basic relationship of teacher and student, and it remains resilient and hopeful. Every day people go into class trying to build something new, and that's the main reason why there's a university. I know research is incredibly important, and that also renews that hope and that energy, but you can have the research without the students. You obviously can't have the teaching without the students, and they bring that hope and energy. And so every day teachers and students sort of embark on that decision to make a change somewhere, and it might be quite a small change, but that's what they're doing. And how can we make that bigger and more hopeful and more and build that across the university? I'm hoping that someone's going to say something about resilience later. I'm going to hang on to not do that just for the minute, but I think if we're holding on to that purpose, that we're doing something that we all value, then that will keep us going, and it always will keep us going, even in the dark times. The amount of work people have done, I know everyone is tired after 7-8 months of pandemic and lockdowns and repeated lockdowns, but somehow we're still going, we're still here, we're still being hopeful. So we always require that. Teaching and learning, we're going to require that human interaction, and a resilient and hopeful university will always remember that that's its primary purpose and keep thinking about it. So I am hopeful.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll hear from Jessica and then Heather.
Thank you. I'm going to try not to do a rant on resilience, because it has been something that I have become more and more aware of and sensitive to the language of resilience in the last 8 or 9 months, as we have asked our students and our faculty and our staff to do more with less. And my real issue with the language of resilience is, okay, no, you can suck it up, get better, deal with more, take more pressure, work within the system. And if you don't thrive or even survive, because the focus of resilience or the narratives of resilience are often on the individual, it's an individual failure without actually challenging the systems that are making people unwell. And so I think about Hamlet. Hamlet's often talked about as, you know, someone who can't make up his mind and can't be resilient, but something is literally rotten in the state of Denmark. The system is broken. The system needs revamping. So a hopeful and resilient institution is one that takes a systems approach to resilience and takes the pressure away from individual expectations around resilience. And I've been starting to build a kind of laundry list of, and we all play this game. If I was to build an imaginary institution, how would I build it? How would I create it? And who would I put in the center of design? And for me, of course, it would be students. That students are the most hopeful, and they're the most canny for navigating systems and structures. But I started a list, and I'd love for us, if we have time in the question and answer, to add to this list, because I think that we need, as we cross through that portal that Arunti Roy is asking us to cross, we have this opportunity to actually articulate some of the features. So very quickly, students at the center and heart of design and decision making, always. more inclusive and compassionate promotion, evaluation, and review. Communication pathways from the macro, meso, micro that is reciprocal. So again, back to this listening, talking among and between groups and finding allies. That full professors need to use their privilege as accomplices for marginalized and precarious staff and faculty. No toxic positivity. And all of us exercising critical empathy, but probably most importantly, some of our educational leaders who are making decisions, but often farthest away from the people whose the decisions affect. And I would add maybe more resources for teaching and learning in the longer term, shorter meetings, or no-fly zones for emails at nights on weekends, and stopping surveillance. We can talk about Proctorio and those other invigilation spaces, but really investing in the human as our greatest asset as an organization. So those are a couple of thoughts.
Heather?
Yeah, so I'm just going to, me too on the resilience stuff. There's a scholar by the name of Michael Orsini from the University of Ottawa who wrote a piece saying essentially we need to pitch resilience. It's in a online journal called Policy Options. And Orsini says that resilience is a plastic word and that it's rooted, like Jessica said, in an individual model of change that leaves untouched the structures in place, structures and conditions not of our own making. And so it can become a real blame game. And so I think we need to pitch resilience and see that it is part of a neoliberal structure that really individualizes what are often broader social and structural, economic, political issues. And so I think, like Jessica, you do need to start thinking through that lens of critical pedagogy or pandemic pedagogy or guerrilla, however you want to frame it, and unpack the various locations of sort of structural oppression, for lack of a better word. But one thing that I do want to note in terms of hope, rather than just sort of saying resilience sucks, we need to also think about hopeful spaces. And one of the things that when you think about guerrillas, remember they worked in cells. So my question would be, who's your cell? Where's the meadow you're going to hang out with people, right? Like, where's your location for now? And understand that those geographies and spaces may change over time, but essentially finding your people and working as co-conspirators and finding your networks as a means by which to disrupt in both small and big ways. Because one of the things about teaching and learning, and this will be my last comment, is that often we don't see the changes that we hope for. But that's because, in part, it's where we're looking, right? So again, go back to the micro, go back to the everyday, because if we're looking for the big, massive structural changes right now, some might be happening, but a lot aren't. But where are those spaces of hope, and where are those spaces of change, and where have some of those changes happened? And work with your cell to identify the awesome places of hope where you can see changes happen. And I think that builds a long-term ability to actually have some dreams.
Thanks, Heather. I'll leave it with Paul and then Claire, and then we'll open it up to an audience Q&A. So for those on the call who would like to think of some questions and pop those in the chat, that would be great. But first, Paul and then Claire.
Thanks. Thanks for reminding us of the cells, Heather. And this cell we formed over the summer around the sense of belonging, kind of culminated in as not only resources that got circulated around the whole university about what a sense of belonging meant and what we could do, but also in two events. Well-attended events, actually, online, of course. One called The Sense of Belonging, and the other called Being Your Authentic Self. And this emerged from this sense of belonging idea. So our hopeful university is one where everyone can be their authentic self. For clarity, that means their authentic self with respect to the university. We all have different authentic selves in different parts of our lives. And that chimed with me about some things I'd learned as right back to the beginning of the story, Jessica, about sort of leadership training you get and all the literature, and authenticity is a characteristic that's said to be highly desirable in a leader. So I decided to look at sort of more critical literature around that, and it's really interesting actually. There is an article by Alger and Litz Wiersma, I don't know how to pronounce their names, that critiques this idea of individual authenticity in a leader, and instead looks really at the organisation and how do you have an organisation where authenticity is the norm and is valued. And in their view, and that such an organisation would be an organisation that's concerned with questions, where everyone in the organisation is concerned with questions such as, is it worthwhile what we do here? Who benefits from this? And what I really like, the question, who do I become as a result of working for this organisation? And I don't think that these kind of questions are often surfaced in my organisation. That they argue that when these questions are regularly discussed, the boundaries between leaders and other organisational members, as well as the boundaries between the organisation and the community of which it's in part, open up. And with Bridget and other colleagues in our guerrilla cell, we've reflected on this and what it might mean. And one of the endpoints is we just started to explore a methodology called listening groups, and that really reflects back on the word listening has come up so well. I think this is these listening groups have been designed really within organisations to surface issues around the fact that ethnic minorities are not heard in ways they should be, and it's a methodology I'm about to learn more about, but where essentially you facilitate a session where leaders within an organisation just listen to perspectives from voices that aren't regularly heard, as I think that's come through lots in other people's responses, and so we really want to create spaces where people can come in and be their authentic self, say their authentic things in the way they want to say them, and that's a hopeful space, I believe. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And just a reminder before we go to Claire, if you have any questions for our panelists, please leave those in the chat.
Many thanks, Heather. I think if I reflect back, I would say that what actually I have learned over the course of the pandemic is that I do believe there are better ways, and driven by smarter policy and looking very carefully at the underlying factors that constrained our thinking before. So it's not a build back, it's a look at how we can be smarter and better and a little bit more inclusive. So as we go forward, I think we need to reflect and draw on that critical hope and make sure we embrace the uncomfortable and look at how we were and make sure we don't return to some of what, quite frankly, was ugliness. So we need to be very mindful of that space. And part of that uncomfortable space for me as I think forward is ensuring that any long-term solutions look at this bigger picture of what goes on beyond our universities, in our societies that maybe aren't as equal as we would like them to be. I think as we look at our students, we need to look at how this situation will affect them. What financial difficulties and personal factors will they now have with them as they go forward, which will inevitably distract them from their learning and will impact upon their achievements as we go forward. And I think that's both whilst they're with us, but ultimately as they go on into employment, it is not a good space at the moment to be a graduate, I don't think. Possibly, certainly within the UK, I'm less familiar outside. So whilst we can be hopeful and emphasise our student successes, I think we need to make sure that we don't occlude of those stories that have slipped through the cracks, people who have suffered significantly. That's my puppy, by the way. And we need to learn from that how we can change and develop and flex. So I think to finish, ultimately, for me, it's about ensuring success for our students demands our attention. to those small spaces, to the minutiae of both place and behaviour of our staff, and ally that to a determination to tackle broad factors which ultimately will impact upon our student journeys. So for me, it's about listening, but it's about listening and valuing. It's about being comfortable with the uncomfortable and then going forward with that hope. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Claire. And as we wait for folks to participate in the chat, I would just like to open this up to really any panelist. I do have a question that came in anonymously. That do you have instances in your own context, whether that's institutionally or nationally, where you have seen hope? Like, what does this look like in practice? I see Jessica nodding. Maybe you want to take that first, and then over to Heather. Okay.
Sure. I'll thank you for that question, and it's very material and it's very visible for me today as a number of our students who are members of the OLTC program, the Online Learning and Teaching Consultant Program, are for me embodied hope. They were trained in June on students as partners and educational technology. Heather Smith was one of the beautiful engineers of their orientation program. We got them to read and to think and to exercise what we called empathetic design. So imagining the positions of faculty, of students, and then their role as educational technology consultants to build COVID classrooms that were at the heart of those classrooms, student designed and student led. And for me, every action there is a hopeful one, and we had about 80 of our faculty go through the program. We're getting ready for winter 2021, and they, for me, are the embodiments of hope in action, hope in practice, and I love them all. So if you want to turn your videos on and wave, I'm very proud of you.
And, Heather,
and silence. You don't have to put your videos on.
Heather, you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to my students again on this one, and sort of this is broadly speaking. I'm trying to phrase it in a way that also doesn't sound self-congratulatory, but whatever, I'll just do it. So I try to create classes in mind with multiple perspectives and include videos of scholars and practitioners other than my white middle-aged self. I try to include readings that are show diverse perspectives, Indigenous perspectives, and perspectives of racialized scholars and gender and queer theory and so forth. So as a result, the students are saying things like, oh my God, I can actually see myself in the field in which I study. And why does that give me hope? So, I mean, this is where it sounds self-congratulatory, but it's not meant to, is that we can create those spaces where the students can see themselves as having the ability to have an authentic voice, to be able to give expression. So again, I think when we think about the micro, it's, what are we designing and how are we designing? And we're creating those spaces. I understand that's a power move, but students will take them. Students will step up and they will say, I am here and this is my opinion. And, I'm an Indigenous student and all this stuff you're talking about is crap, which is amazing. And, right. And so if we create those spaces, then it's just like, they'll take them. But a lot of students actually don't trust the spaces. And so we have to work through that, right? They don't actually believe that we really want to hear their voices. So if we do it in a trustful, authentic space, man, they will blow your mind. And you set it free and you will learn from them, whether they're 18 or 25 or 46 or whatever. So for me, the hope comes from just something that I try to do as a practice. And the students remind me again and again and again of why we do this. So there we go.
Thank you. We have one more question, or actually two questions in the chat. One referencing the quote of walk the threshold though lightly. And one of our participants would love to hear a panelist respond to that of how do we create this lightness in these current times. Would anyone like to take that question?
I can come in and just highlight the. I just posted a link in the chat. An amazing thing that happened. We appointed a new vice chancellor. That's the most senior position in the UK system at the University of Leeds. Simone Buitendag, and she joins us in September in the middle of all this. And she posted this blog, and it basically says you can't do everything. It's not possible. What you're all trying to do is too hard. Stop doing it. And, so many people around the organisation reacted so well to that. And it's just the fact she said it meant so much to so many people. It was incredible. So it really shows how people in leadership positions can really make a difference. What she actually followed that up with was like some extra days holiday at Christmas for all staff, and so now everyone in the organisation is saying everyone's going home and getting away from work and study over Christmas. But I just wanted to highlight that the fact that individuals can make a big difference. Okay, she's in a very senior position, but share that. Tell your own rectors, vice chancellors, whoever they are, they need to post things like that and just say it's okay not to be perfect.
Thanks, Paul, and that also speaks really well to our other question, which is how do we get to a culture of wellness and well-being? Heather Smith, did you want to add something to that?
No, I wasn't raising my hand. I was thinking.
Oh,
I'll leave the space
Rachel,
for...
I believe.
Yeah.
Well, again, building on those things and also coming back to that idea of lightness, and I'm overusing the word agency, but I just feel it's really important. I'm just going to give you anecdotes always, but earlier on today I was talking to a PhD student in sociology. That's not my field, by the way. I'm a physicist by long ago background. But she wanted to talk to me because she's done some research on our university statistics about achievement, and students with certain characteristics do less well. That's a common challenge across the sector, but she was really worried about how people would treat her findings, and she said people have already said to her, oh yeah, but what about white working class males? That's also a group who don't always do very well, but she'd focused on black and minority ethnic, which is a horrible phrase that we are stuck with at the moment in the UK students. And what I felt was that she has no agency, so she has no lightness in going through this door. Because she doesn't feel that what's on the other side of the door is where she's meant to be, and actually we need her to go through that door and tell us what she's found, because research is research and the findings are important. But she can't get through that door. So Sarah's question about providing the lightness, I think, is about, again, coming back to this idea of communities and my brain's ceasing to function, but this idea of these guerrilla cells that are working together and providing somebody with that lightness, even though they don't have anything to share themselves, but they can provide that and they can walk through the door with them. So we need those doors to be quite wide and we need to walk through them together. That was my answer, which is metaphorical, but I think something we can apply.
Perfect, and that's a great way to end our panel today. I just wanted to say thank you for the audience, and thank you for our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to share these messages of hope with us. I have